All right, welcome back, everyone. My name is Jeremy Milloy. As I said, I teach labor working class history here at Wayne. Really excited for the second panel, which is about sharing the stories of and for workers. And I thought as a way of introduction, we talked in the first section how we don't get enough labor news in the United States. So we certainly don't get enough labor news from Canada. So I thought I'd share the breaking labor news that QP Flight Attendants Union, which is on a legal strike, is in a strike position and on strike, was ordered back to work by the Canadian government the other day and refused to because they believe that the right to strike in Canada should mean something. They've now been ordered back to work by a labor mediator and again have said they will stay out on strike, with the president saying if somebody has to go to jail for something like this, I guess I'm going to jail. So please give them your support, your solidarity. I know reaching out and hearing from comrades across the border here in the United States would be especially meaningful now. This is a really important struggle for all workers in Canada. So it's my pleasure to introduce people who tell worker stories and union stories so well. So importantly, we have David Elsila, Annemarie Strassel, and Jonathan Kissam. We're going to go in order and then have a Q&A. And to start, we have David Elsila from the UAW and Solidarity Magazine.
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to thank the staff of labor at Wayne and the Reuther Library for organizing this very timely panel to discuss how we tell stories of and for workers. Let me start by describing how I first heard stories about workers. Many years ago, as I was getting dressed for high school at Redmond Union High School outside of Detroit here, one morning I turned on the radio. And I happened to go to a station that I had never listened to before. And the gravelly voiced announcer was telling a story about workers who were involved in this struggle for a new union contract with their employer. And that story was followed by some local news, some music, some sports scores, and then a commentary about economic justice by a professor whose name I still remember many years later, Pat Cahill Sexton, who we taught at New York University in New York. And what I heard on that station, on that radio program, really appealed to my youthful idealism. And so every morning I would tune into that program while I was getting ready for school. The program was called Eye Opener, and it was sponsored by the UAW, and it was hosted by somebody named Guy Nunn. In those days, the UAW actually had a radio department, which Guy Nunn headed. And in addition to hosting its radio programs, which were aired in cities with large UAW populations around the country, the UAW also began a weekly television program called Telescope. And those radio shows, which frequently included commentary on inequality, on civil rights, and union campaigns, were my first introduction to the labor movement, and what I heard led me to really want to be part of the labor movement, of that movement. So I became a classroom teacher for a while. I joined the American Federation of Teachers, and I worked as editor of its publications. And then only 20 years after hearing those UAW radio shows, I went to work for the UAW as editor of Solidarity Magazine, a position which I held for about 22 years. And Solidarity at that time was a really, we were encouraged to do class-based journalism, but we didn't just focus on bread and butter issues involving bargaining and strikes and so on. But we covered our union, other unions. We covered the stories from air traffic controllers. We covered stories. We sent reporters to South Korea during the Olympics in Seoul to talk about conditions of South Korean workers. We went to send reporters to Mexico to talk about the plight of Mexican workers. We tried to have a really broad-based look at the working class, both in this country and abroad. And but the radio shows, I think, were really what attracted me to during the labor movement. Back in those years in mid-century America, many unions used radio to tell worker stories. The Chicago Federation of Labor owned the radio station WCFL. In New York, there was WEVD, EVD standing for Eugene V. Debs, which carried a lot of progressive labor programming. The American Federation of Labor sponsored a nightly national newscast. And here in Detroit, that program I listened to eye opener in the morning and shift break in the afternoon, where the UAW's drive time shows that told worker stories to a large audience. In fact, that audience was so large that it worried the hell out of General Motors. And in her book, Selling Free Enterprise, the author Elizabeth Holmes Wolfe describes how General Motors actually sent investigators into an employee parking lot to peer into the windows of the workers' cars to find out where the analog dial on the car radios of those cars were set. And they found that a substantial number were tuned to CKLW, the radio station that carried the UAW's shows. Now, we may not have those kinds of radio programs today, union radio shows today, but unions have moved into the digital age and are using social media like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and blogs, and have built their own websites to tell stories of and for workers. The UAW, for example, has a great Facebook page where it posts updates on strikes, other labor stories, and vignettes about labor history. The same with other unions. Last week, for example, I watched several short TikTok reels by musicians local 802 in New York City about their fight for a new contract for Broadway musicians. So, in truth of advertising, my son Michael is communications director for that local and produced those TikTok reels. But a lot of unions are doing that throughout the country. And many union publications, like the ones that I used to edit, are now produced digitally online in addition to or in the place of print. Now, since I retired many years ago from the UAW, I've been spending a lot of my time helping to tell workers' stories with the Michigan Labor History Society. And I'd like to talk today about how the Labor History Society has learned to think outside the box in terms of using many, many different ways of telling worker stories. We use a wide variety of ways. We do publications, of course. We have a publication like this one, the Looking Back, Looking Forward. We have produced a little guidebook to art in Detroit, labor art in Detroit, where visitors can find their way to the Diego Rivera murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts. We've even produced a map of the state of Michigan with labor sites on it, and the stories about each of these sites annotated on the back side, so that you can really use this as a guide to a road trip around the state of Michigan, learning worker stories at many different sites in the state. So we're thinking outside the box and using all of these kinds of tools to tell workers' stories. And the theme that brings all of this together is our slogan, looking back and moving forward, because we think by telling these worker stories, we can inspire workers today with the stories of what the grandparents and parents in the past did to struggle and to win victories, and hopefully inspire people to do those kinds of struggles today. I think one of Michigan's most famous labor stories, of course, is how workers in Flint took over a General Motors plant for more than a month in 1937 to win recognition of their union. And that story of that sit-down strike, which we have told many times to many workers in many ways, still reverberates. 71 years after the Flint sit-down strike, in 2008, workers at the Republic Doors and Windows Factory in Chicago, represented by the United Electrical Workers, started their own sit-down strike, occupying their plants to protest management's decision to suddenly close. And we saw the parallels with 1937 here in Detroit. So we invited those workers to Detroit, we called a public meeting, which our friend Bryce helped organize, attended by hundreds of Detroiters to honor those Republic workers. And we found two veterans of the Flint sit-down strike who were still with us and brought them down from Flint. And so that they could tell their stories along with the younger workers from Chicago to the same audience. And those young Chicago workers shared the stage with these older Flint sit-down veterans and thanking them for their inspiration, said to them, "We stood on your shoulders." It was really a rousing event and an example of history repeating itself. And even Motown legend Martha Reeves, the Motown singer, a member of the Detroit Federation of Musicians, came to the rally and sang to the crowd, and she changed her signature song, "Dancing in the Streets," to "Marching in the Streets." It was really a wonderful event. We've been thinking outside, we've stopped outside the box a lot, and we've been looking for other ways to tell workers' stories. The wall map I'll show you of the guidebook to public art, labor art in Detroit, show you. And we have done a number of other things. For example, several years ago, we organized an annual event called Labor Fest, where workers could come together after the annual Labor Day parade, and musicians like Billy Bragg would come and sing union songs. The Carpenters Union ran a nail driving contest for kids to try to get them interested in joining the trades. Other unions handed out educational information at their exhibits. Poets and writers recited their poems and short stories about workers events, labor events. And it was a wonderful success. We had it for probably 4 or 5 years until we ran out of money. We had to stop the labor fest. And I hope we can resume at some point. And yet another way that we have told worker stories is through public art. In 2001, for Detroit's tricentennial, the labor movement decided to make a gift of public art to the people of Detroit. We invited artists and sculptors from all over the country to give us their best ideas for a work of art that would do 3 things. Number 1, inform the public about workers' history. Number 2, honor the working women and men who built our city. And number 3, inspire workers with a vision, with labor's vision for a better world. So we laid these ideas out to more than 120 artists and sculptors who came to Detroit for the competition. We told them the only thing we don't want is a statue of dead white men. Come up with any other ideas. So these artists and sculptors wandered over the Detroit waterfront, where the city of Detroit had given us space for this monument, and they sketched and they took photographs and they submitted their plans. The winning design, which you can see today on the waterfront, is called Transcending, the Labor Legacy Landmark. It is a sweeping steel arch, 62 feet high, surrounded by bronze reliefs of assembly line workers, teachers, construction workers, musicians, and others whose stories are told there. The walkways in the monument are inscribed with labor's legacies like free public education, equality for women, and more. The central platform carries dozens of quotations from labor and civil rights leaders and others, like Myra Wolfgang, who was the leader of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union for many years. And her little clip was, "Women were in labor before men were born." One of these popular titles of that. So we ran a 2-year campaign to raise funds for this project, and with donations of individual Detroit workers, their unions, and their supporters, we raised $1.6 million to build the product. And now thousands of people visit the Labor Legacy landmark each year, learning about workers' stories, learning about workers' history. It's become one of Detroit's icons that's featured on the cover of Detroit Road Atlas. It's on TV commercials and more. And the Metro Times, which is Detroit's alternative weekly newspaper, gave us a special award for the best new art in downtown Detroit. And they wrote in their award citation, stand with your back to the river and look up the skyscrapers, symbols of capitalism through the ring that labor built. Still another way to tell worker stories, thinking outside the box again, is through labor history tours. Over the last dozen years, we have taken literally thousands of people on walking and bus tours to the sites of the Ford Hunger March, the Battle of the Overpass, the sit-down strikes in downtown Detroit, and even to the Motown Museum, where artists have a rich history with the Detroit Federation of Museums. We've got knowledgeable guides who will take you on these tours for free, including our retired letter carrier, John Dick, who is one of our guides and who sometimes will sing, "Please, Mr. Postman," when he stops at the Motown Museum and tell these stories. Then we, of course, I'll show you our newsletter, Looking Back and Moving Forward, which comes out about once a year. And this is another way to tell worker stories in a more traditional way. In this latest issue, we've got a cover story about the 30th anniversary of the Detroit newspaper strike. There's a story here about the pro-labor early mayor of Detroit, Hazen Pingree. We've got a story about the federal school strike of the 1930s and a lot more that will tell worker stories through print media. Then we also do public meetings couple of times a year or more to tell worker stories. So we have featured authors talks on new books about labor history. We've shown films, including one on the 1913 copper strike up in northern Michigan in the Upper Peninsula, on the Italian Hall disaster. There, we've done a talk on former Mayor Coleman Young's fight with HUAC, meeting on the 1963 Walk to Freedom with Martin Luther King in Detroit, women in Michigan's labor movement, and more. These are stories that we told at meetings. And our latest project, and this is really thinking outside the box, is to tell the story of labor through musical theater. On October 10th, 11th, and 12th, we're going to be presenting a labor jazz opera called Forgotten, the Murder at the Ford Rouge Plant, a show with more than 20 actors, singers, dancers, and musicians who tell the story about how Detroit became a union town in the 1930s. And Forgotten has a really interesting worker story in it. It's based on much of it is based on the life of the Reverend Louis Bradford, who had been a minister at the Central Methodist Church in downtown Detroit on Grand Circus Park. And he broadcast every year, every week, a radio program called The Forgotten Man's Hour, in which he interviewed homeless and jobless and unemployed workers over the radio station WXYZ. He saw this as a contrast to the anti-Semitic broadcasts of Father Coughlin, who broadcast on WJR. And the strength of this program was letting the workers tell their own stories. It's something that Hamilton talked about earlier today in terms of hearing the stories directly from workers being a very powerful way of providing messages. Anyway, that was his radio show. Well, he had a young daughter, Reverend Bradford, a young daughter named Little Ella, and she was sick. She had a serious illness and needed medical care. So he, not making very much money as a minister, ministers don't make a lot of money, and there was no health insurance in those days. He had to take a job at the Ford Rouge plant to earn some money to pay for his daughter's medical care. And while he was at Ford's, he tried to interest company bosses into treating their workers well, to developing better relationships with workers. And that didn't fly. And of course, they were very opposed to that kind of a message, and his plans were rebuffed. And so in November of 1937, just a few months after the Battle of the Overpass, where a lot of Union organizers have been injured and attacked by foreign goons for passing out literature, just a few months after that, Louis Bradford was found seriously, fatally injured on the shop floor at the Rouge plant, and he died a few days later from his injuries. And the company said, oh, you know, he fell, it was an accident. Family never believed that story, and always felt that foul play was involved. And so 50 years later, his great nephew, Louis Bradford's great nephew, Steve Jones, comes to Detroit to investigate his great uncle's death. He had heard these family stories over the years about Louis Bradford, and so Steve started doing some digging, and he dug out the autopsy report for his great uncle. And he took the autopsy report to the Wayne County medical examiner, who looked at it and said, this was no accident. This likely was homicide. And Steve, who is an accomplished musician and a member of the Musicians Union, proceeded to write 22 songs, wonderful songs, telling the story of his uncle and telling the stories of workers who were trying to organize back in those days and who created unions and built Detroit into a union town. We put on that play in 2004. We premiered it in Detroit. Put it on again in 2005 and 2010. And now, 15 years later, we're going to revive it at Detroit's Marygrove Theater with a brand new cast. Tickets are on sale for just $35. And you can take this card, which I put on everybody's table, and use the QR code to buy tickets with the play. And we've already sold over 200 seats. So if you are interested in going, you better hurry up and order your tickets. We hope you'll come and see this amazing show. Let me just wrap up things by noting that in our current environment, many working people are often led to believe that they are forgotten and are powerless. We need to combat that notion, and we can do so by telling stories about workers who have fought and turned things around in the past. And we can use the airwaves, we can use social media, we can use public art, we can use labor history tours, we can use traditional print publications, we can use public meeting events, we can use music, theater, and all of these methods, all of these devices and more to remind workers that they are not forgotten, that they are not powerless, and that like their parents and their grandparents who fought for justice, they can fight and they can win too.
Thank you so much. I would say that we do have the Women Have Been in Labor button over there, but it's our most popular button, so it might be gone, but we do have a lot of great labor buttons. Another way to share labor history with small way. Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Annemarie Strassel, who is Director of Communications for Unite here. Annemarie?
Thank you. That was so inspiring, Dave. Thank you. And I just wanted to thank Labor at Wayne and just all of the panelists. It's kind of an intimidating act to follow. So I just want to thank you guys for allowing me to be part of this today. If you'll indulge me, I feel like we're in the house of history, the house of archive. I'd like to start with a little bit of history. In 1946, an organizer with the UAW Education Department named Elizabeth Hawes published Hurry Up, Please, It's Time, an urgent appeal to the labor movement to unite post-war amid the increasing pressures of what she dubbed native fascists, who were closing down the possibilities of utopia that she and her peers had imagined organizing through the Depression and World War II. She writes, "If the unions crumble before the attempts of the capitalists to break them, we will have fascism. If the unions unite, by the very force of their unity and determined fight for democracy, all true anti-fascists, farmers, intellectuals, professionals will be drawn to work with them. Without the unions, other democratic anti-fascist groups cannot win the fight. Working with the unions, they will hasten this victory. She had an unlikely path to the union movement. She left a successful career as an American fashion designer in 1939 to fight the war against fascism, moving to Detroit to work with the UAW and connect with women working in wartime plants. She was actually the first household name in American fashion. She had a very, very big platform before turning to work within the labor movement. I became familiar with her while I was in grad school at Yale, working on my PhD and campaigning to unionize graduate students. Today, I work for Unite Here, a union of mostly hospitality workers, hotels, casinos, and food service workers spread over 100 cities across North America. And for more than a decade, I served as the communications director for the union. And I left my academic career 20 years ago, but today my heart feels more connected to cause and the panic she felt more than ever. When I joined the union in 1999, I didn't see myself as an activist, but I understood the ways that power shaped possibility. When we were organizing under the Bush administration, a time when graduate teachers and researchers at private universities were classified as students, not workers, we were stripped of protections and a pathway to recognition under the NLRA. We weren't just fighting Yale, we were fighting for our work to be recognized as such. Our campaign was only possible because other campus workers had our backs. Dining hall workers, grounds maintenance, librarians, office assistants, and more, all fortified by decades of strikes at the most anti-union university in the nation. These workers knew the only way to change the balance of power was to support more workers organizing like us. Through strikes and arrests and protest after protest, I saw one of the poorest cities in the country flip the script on one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the world. It was electrifying. I had never felt that power growing up in Ypsilanti, Michigan. After a big GM plant closed to move to Texas for cheaper labor pastures in 1993, our local economy was hit really hard. I was in my sophomore year at Ypsi High, and the entire school system almost shut down 2 months early because of the devastating budget shortfall. I remember angry town hall meetings and school gyms, people fighting over the scraps to keep the doors open, cut the arts, cut adult education, cut after school programs. In the end, they cut 40 teachers, a devastating loss for a town our size. We felt so powerless, divided, and angry. I remember in New Haven wishing that I had known how to come together as a community back then, how different things could have been. I ultimately left the academic career path to work for Unite Here, which was the parent union of the unions at Yale. I wanted more control over my life than I could have as an academic, staring down a life of postdocs and adjuncting, chasing the dream of a tenure track position, which is, in the end, just a job. And I liked being part of a community, as academics were really trained to go it alone, to carve our own path. And that frontier mindset, it's a frontier mindset that puts on a pedestal the value of autonomy above all else. With the union, I left behind the insecurities and isolation that this mindset can instill, the intellectual paralysis and fraud complexes that can insidiously corrode a curious mind, especially if you don't fit the typical mold, and I certainly did not. I was hired by an organizing director in Chicago in 2007, becoming the first IU comms campaigner working outside the headquarters office in New York City. The organizing director hoped that generating earned media might help workers organize in the Midwest to win the union. She just didn't know how to do it. And truth is, I didn't really either, but I was willing to figure it out. I really cared about the union. I was not a trained PR professional, thank God. And I was really willing to teach myself. At the time, the media landscape was completely different. There was only maybe 2 or 3 labor reporters left in the country, all of them deeply cynical after having seen good fights get crushed and the labor movement stagnate. And frankly, I think they had started to think of themselves as part of a dinosaur beat. And there was a lot of insecurity about that. What got written about labor was often skeptical, if not outright hostile. My colleagues saw the media as a depersonalized monolith, loyal to the editorial perspectives of its corporate ownership. They'd never get the story right, why try? But I got to know people in the industry through my work. Local news crews patrolling wintry Chicago at 5 a.m. to cover picket lines with only minutes to prepare stories before the 6 a.m. broadcast. Journalists stripped of beats, having to cover in-depth stories without the benefit of time or subject area expertise, churning out written stories in a day, if not hours. I saw the media more as people trying to do their jobs with as much integrity as possible, under grueling conditions and crushing speed. I developed a way of working that relied less on having the perfect pitch and more on being easy to work with. I learned what reporters wanted to write about. I knew what their editors were pushing them to write about. I came up with supportable facts. And I made it easy to connect with real workers who are on the front lines of fights. I invited reporters to step away from their desks and embed themselves in worker actions, often against the advice of the seasoned PR specialists in our New York office who said these actions weren't news. But they had never seen the look on somebody's face the first time they stood up to their manager with 30 of their colleagues behind them. It was powerful, and reporters who witnessed it saw it too, writing primetime stories for the local paper about the hometown employee of the year who got fired trying to unionize. Some of the best reporting came from unlikely pro-business publications like Cranes, reporters who I worked with over time, staid guys in button-down shirts who I nudged into joining housekeepers storming corporate shareholder meetings. I didn't think of it consciously at the time, but in essence, my work with reporters was organizing. Direct action isn't just about demonstrating our power to the boss. These actions help us feel our own collective power for workers and for the reporters who work with us. Over time, my role evolved into a national one. In 2009, hotel contracts expired with 45,000 workers across North America, and we had non-union hotel drives in many more markets. It was a really tough year. We were in the middle of a really nasty internal union split, and I was one of only a handful of comm staffers that remained with United here after the New York department left. I didn't really connect with the old comms department, who mostly functioned as a branding arm of the IU and brokered interviews for the former union president. I wanted to build a department of people anchored in locals with robust organizing drives and internal fights. In the depths of the recession, the hotels were out for blood, hoping to claw back gains that we had achieved in a boom economy. We didn't have the money to hire more staff or an expensive PR firm, so I worked with anyone I could find in different cities, community organizers, researchers, organizers, anyone who could make phone calls to local reporters and TV news desks. I traveled the country training hundreds of workers to share their stories, a bedrock of our campaign that still holds true today. And I honestly take it as a personal failing if I'm quoted in a story. I don't train people to memorize talking points. It was about developing a personal story and understanding the strategy behind telling it. Getting interviewed by a reporter, unless these reporters, can be really intimidating. But most of the people I trained, they were dishwashers, housekeepers, cooks. They worked back of the house, seen, not heard. But armed with a powerful personal story, you can handle any question that came your way. No one is more of an expert in your story than you. And I knew that people following the news would relate more to a fight if they saw themselves within it. Frankly, a union boss on TV doesn't always look so different than an employer boss. I found that it wasn't enough to be in a do or die battle with the industry. We had to dramatize the fight if we wanted the press to pick it up. Just days before contracts were set to expire, fired the entire housekeeping staff in 3 Boston properties, requiring workers to train the subcontracted workers who would replace them. It confirmed everything we knew about how the industry used economic crisis as an opportunity to crush workers. In Chicago, where the company was headquartered, we organized a civil disobedience action in front of the Park Hyatt on Michigan Avenue, a residence of the billionaire family that owned the chain. With helicopters circling overhead and TV crews standing by, more than 100 workers and allies shut down the street wearing signs that read, "We are not afraid."
defying a time when working people were told they should just be happy to have a job. More than 1,000 hotel workers and allies in 15 cities across North America took a rest that day. With my MacGyver team, media organizers embedded in each city, we landed hundreds of stories in local and national news, and including a featured story in the New York Times, which hadn't covered our organizing for years. It gave me a taste of what was possible, even without a professional department or budget. Those stories we generated were important, not just for waking up the industry that lay ahead, but for reflecting back to workers acting bravely in the face of fear and uncertainty that their actions were monumental. In the years that followed, I went to lead that ad hoc national team and eventually became the director of communications. For time, we built a network of specialists who are deeply embedded in local fights. And I have turned over the department to that team of people whose capacity far exceeds my own, rank and file leaders and journalists who have led their own union efforts and have added critical muscle to our team. About a decade ago, I moved to Detroit to be closer to my family and to start my own. And after years of seeing what Unite Here could do in other places, it's been like a real privilege to be part of building the union here in Michigan and in the city that I call my own. In October of 2023, I led media outreach for the Detroit casino strike when 3,700 workers shut down the entire Detroit casino industry. Five unions banded together: Unite Here, the UAW, the Teamsters, the operating engineers, and the carpenters to lead the first ever wall-to-wall casino strike in history, uniting guest room attendants, cashiers, valets, engineers, dealers, restaurant servers, cooks, and more. These workers survived the pandemic shutdowns and returned to work in the scariest of times to keep the industry alive. I met workers who got so sick after coming back to work they almost died. Others did not make it. But the casino industry never repaid its debt of gratitude. Profits were back, but many jobs never returned. The raises on the table didn't come close to keeping pace with inflation. Rage ensued, the kind of anger that is hard to put back in the bottle. The strikes happened at the same time as the UAW took on the big three, so there was a feeling of shared struggle and militancy that animated the whole fight. We couldn't compete with the national headlines that were being generated by the big three strike, but we dominated the local news cycle for 2 months straight, and it meant something to strikers to see their struggle reflected back in the morning and evening news when they returned from the line. In the end, we won the biggest raises in the history of the casino industry in Detroit, but there was something more. I really realized the power of being in an industry that's at the heart of a city, and it was really powerful to work alongside other unions. Challenging, but really powerful to do that. Every day of that 2-month strike, the city crawled with thousands of picketers on the lines, marching throughout downtown, filling city hall chambers many times over. And for that moment in time, it changed the way the city felt, reviving a spirit of labor that has defined Detroit's identity for more than a century. Local media helped to capture and reverberate that energy. They were rooting for us. Since my early days, I've seen a new generation of reporters emerge, radicalized by the recession and organizing themselves against the odds into unions as part of a broader wave of organizing in the media and culture industries. Some of whom are with us today. But across the progressive spectrum, there's a deep concern about losing narrative ground among working class Americans that is permitting our slide into fascism. All the research points to the critical role unions have to play in cutting through the noise as trusted messengers and as organizations that reach a broad ideological cross-section of our country. You can't decide who the boss hires. So if you want to organize your workplace, you have to get along with people you might not otherwise agree with. It's what separates unions from every other affinity group in civil society. But can we do it big enough and fast enough to survive? As Hawes says, hurry up, please, it's time. Against the backdrop of regime polarization and social media isolation, the value and promise of true solidarity, true union solidarity feels more important than ever. It's time, and it's up to us in the labor movement to name the war on immigrants in this country for what it is, an attack on all workers, foreign here or not. In our industries already plagued by chronic understaffing, we are losing tens of thousands of people who have been the backbone of the tourism economy for decades. On the one hand, you have families being cruelly ripped apart and others going into hiding after living in this country with legal status for decades. On the other, you have workers left behind, expected to carry the load with forced overtime. They are exhausted and struggling to get by. This divide and conquer mentality is decimating our communities and crushing workers. As unions, we are uniquely poised to speak out and reframe the attacks for what they are, a crass power grab by people who want more money and control, further dividing working people, so we are too weak to fight back. To do so, we have to think creatively about what will cut through the noise in a world where people are fatigued by politics and demoralized about the potential for change. Some say we should invest in more social influencers, and it's what the billionaire-backed conservative movement did to stoke reactionary fear in an era of passive news consumption, abetted by the platforms themselves who control the circulation of that same content. And this may be necessary, but it's painful for me to watch money continuously pour into the very platforms that are eroding our democracy and our social fabric. For our union, I've watched social media create occasional breakthroughs that inspire a broad audience, but these feeds are voracious. They're a fire that requires constant oxygen and fuel with less and less payout. They favor charismatic individuals more than organizations, as evidenced by the meteoric success of the Mamdani campaign. They demand constant productivity, which I think is too often met with formulaic share graphics and exhausted forms. I think that it is extinguishing the kind of creativity and artfulness that can cut through the constant war for our attention. At a certain point in your life, you have to ask, do I want to spend the rest of my life churning out reels? And if so, if that's for you, good. But it is, for me, not so much. And since January, I've seen a shift for unions looking to band together and to learn from one another. We are a movement of auto workers, housekeepers, and grocery workers, and nurses, and construction workers, yes. We're also a movement of cultural workers, musicians, journalists, screenwriters, designers, actors, teachers, and artists. Together, we have talents to share and stories to tell that defy the occupational and jurisdictional containers that we as a movement have created for ourselves. What if our show of solidarity went beyond the picket line to working collaboratively to seed our culture with stories anchored by the values we share as a movement? A commitment to plurality, community, and caring for one another despite our differences. The power that we have together that we cannot find alone. Hollywood went on strike, but it's been almost 50 years since Norma Rae graced our screens. If we spent less time generating reels and more time making art, what more could be possible? This comes down to more time and attention imagining the future we want to see and taking on the fights that get us closer to it. More showing than telling about the power of the union and the world we want to build in a world organizing. And for me, it's the next chapter. I'm looking to explore a way of reintegrating who I was in the past as an artist and an intellectual into a hope for the future. I feel so inspired by all the different examples that you gave. I want to talk to you a lot about those. I can't help but be inspired by the generation of organizers like Hawes, cultural workers who understood the power of culture to shape working class consciousness, centering working people as heroes and stories, bridging the social divides and showing possibility for change in a world stacked against most of us that hold real potential for narrative change. I think that's a holds real potential for narrative change. Sometimes we must look to the past to see our future.
So much. I think it's so important to hear, in a state of constant crisis and constant interpolation to react and do something now that we're constantly filled in, that we think that not only the culture, but also the forms that we create are rooted in our values, not just the messaging. It's something I've really been thinking about a lot. Thank you. Our final speaker is Jonathan Kissam with the United Electrical Workers.
Thanks. So now's the awkward moment that I'd say that everyone's been asking the last name wrong. It's actually Kissam.
Oh my God.
Sorry, I never remember to tell people that. So for folks who aren't familiar with UE, the union that I work for, just really briefly, the full name is the United Electrical Radio Machine Workers of America. It is in full iambic pentameter, I believe. And we were the first union chartered by the CIO in 1936. So our original base is not electricians, but people who work in the electrical manufacturing industry, GE workers, Westinghouse workers, Sylvania workers, kind of thing. Back in the heyday of the CIO, we were one of the big three, called the Big Three CIO unions, along with auto workers and steel workers. Much like those unions, we've suffered a lot of membership loss due to deindustrialization, have significantly broadened the types of workers that we organize into many, many different sectors. Unlike those unions, we were in the late 40s directly targeted by this rising tide of fascism that the sister from the UAW was speaking about, and nearly red baited out of existence in 1949 and so forth, including sadly by some of our brothers and sisters in the rest of the labor. So we're now a very small union, much smaller than the auto workers still. As the communications director, I was until about a year ago. I was the entire communications department, in fact, when I hired on about 8 years ago. So because of that, I've done a range of things, both in terms of like the work helping our members get into the the traditional media or the mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, but also in the form of editing the union paper, the UE News, being right. So I sort of want to talk about those. Before I joined the staff in 2017, I was a rank and file member for about 2 decades. Mostly as a part-time customer service representative in the entertainment industry, because for UE we have one of everything, and but also for several years I was a member of a worker co-op that did basically communications consulting, and our biggest client was the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So I also for several years in the late 2010s was essentially the entire communications department for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, but they were still very small. So I also sort of bring that perspective. So I think in terms of thinking about the media, I think it's, in UE we're materialists. So I think it's useful to start thinking a little bit about the political economy of the media. So I want to refine a little bit on some of the changes in the media of the 20th century that Brother Nolan mentioned earlier. When our unions were organized, we were in a landscape of daily print papers, eventually radio, and then network broadcast television, right? All of this had in common sort of a daily news cycle delivered by for-profit entities, but which nonetheless, in order to make a profit, had to appeal to a broad audience, right? Looking for a share of the whole market. And also to some degree, particularly television required some capital investment, right? And this was actually still largely true when I joined the labor movement in the mid-90s. And I think that creates sort of like and I think a lot of the changes in the media environment, that's still to some degree true of local broadcasts, particularly broadcast television, right? And when we're talking about getting stories into local media markets, I think there is still this sort of like mass interest thing. But when we think about sort of the broader political impact of the media, there are obviously it's a vastly different landscape. And I think 2 things particularly happened. The first one of which is not the internet, right? So before the internet, or before the internet was known outside of nerds, the polarization began to be a viable market strategy, right? And you sort of see this with the rise of Fox News in the 80s, but particularly in the 90s, the rise of sort of talk radio people like Rush Limbaugh, where they sort of discovered that you actually can make a profit by shearing off part of the audience, right? And this grew, right? And then you also had like MSNBC and so forth, right? So, grew out. So there was a really like a shift, I think, in the models of media that really predated the internet in that. And then, of course, you had the internet, right? And sort of the collapse of traditional media, especially print. And this, and I think a thing that this really did is it removed a voice of authority and this, both in the sense of, many of these outlets simply just were removed, like simply don't exist anymore, right? Or, local papers no longer employ reporters, right? To report on stuff happening locally. And obviously print, which is just extreme end. But also in the sense of the remaining outlets, because the remaining sort of traditional media outlets that exist, like the New York Times, right, essentially the only paper that still really functions anymore as what newspapers used to be, becoming more removed, right, from the day-to-day concerns of work. The New York Times is not a paper for the working people of New York City, right, in any meaningful way, if it ever was, right? But it is a purveyor of elite opinion. It's not interested, if it ever was, right? But since it is all that is left, it's not interested. And so this sort of fracturing of the media landscape because of the internet, I think is both. It's good and bad, right? It's both freeing in terms of it allows us new avenues to reach people directly. It's hard to imagine the Bernie Sanders campaign succeeding, right, in a sort of pre-internet era. Because those voices of authority were not interested in giving up their authority. They enforced strict political parameters, right? But it also makes it harder to shift consensus opinion, right? Because there is no consensus. And so, where we see this, I think, in our work is, on the one hand, particularly our younger membership, a lot of our organizing, the average age of our members is about 17 at this point. In a lot of the sort of organizing among younger workers, they are able to reach each other and sort of create through social media in ways that I don't fully understand as an old man, but ways that were not possible, right? When I was trying to organize my coworkers in the mid-90s. But also it means that the institutions that might have once cared about what the coverage was in the local paper, institutions particularly like universities and sort of local employers, no longer really do. And then of course, this also creates the fertile ground for conspiracy theories, right? So, what do we do in this context? I'm definitely a bit of a traditionalist in this, and I think, finding and telling compelling stories, right? I totally co-sign Sister Kelly's point about the voice of labor really needs to be the voice of rank and file workers. That's what's compelling. And that's, in fact, as a staff person in UE, I'm actually forbidden to speak to the media, right? Except for insofar as to connect them with rank and file workers and elected rank and file leaders. Also, I think as Sister Strassel pointed out, they sort of the approach of understanding journalists as workers, right? And that our job as labor communicators is to make their job easier, and sort of understanding the pressures that they're under because of all these massive economic changes in the industry. And then also I think, it's particularly important, I think, to, use plain language to explain complex ideas, right? But also I think there's, and to take action, right? That nothing is more compelling than workers actually taking action. Right? I think the sort of the story, right? Bringing a reporter along to see what it's like when workers confront the boss. And that's also, I think, why, it's important to have a fighting union. Part of our philosophy as a union, part of why we were such a target in the 40s and 50s is we never gave up the fight for control over the shop floor. Right, we did not co-sign the Treaty of Detroit, as people have talked about And so we believe that the best way to keep our members engaged is to be constantly picking fights with the boss on the shop floor and having local leaders in the workplace leading response. And because, the boss is always, picking a fight with the boss is not difficult because the boss is always doing something bad, right? Generally. But I think it's also important that we need to pay attention to the way in which individual stories fit into larger overall narratives. And I think a lot about when I was working for the domestic workers, and we had gotten a legislation called the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights passed in New York State that sort of sets some basic minimum standards for the industry. And we're working on a similar campaign in California. And domestic workers are incredibly compelling, characters for me. Right? They are incredibly hardworking, overwhelmingly women of color, mostly immigrant women, a lot of single mothers. They work really hard taking care of other people's families and have to abandon their own families to do so, right? Just in order to feed their families. And we were very good in Domestic Workers, National Domestic Workers Alliance, at bringing those workers forward. But I remember there was this one point where we got a story, and I think it was the LA Times. And the organizers were very excited and sort of sent it around. And it was they had gotten the reporter to interview two members of affiliated organizations. And they had very compelling stories, and that was the first half of the article. And the second half of the article were these very compelling stories of individuals with disabilities who were very concerned that if this legislation passed, they would not be able to afford the care that they need. Now, obviously, partly this was a political problem, right? We had not done the organizing of building relationships with the disability rights community. But it was also part of the way that story was structured was the narrative arc of there's this really compelling problem and people want to do good about it, but the solution will cause more harm than good, right? This is a story arc that we see all the time, right? To discredit things. And it really struck me how much our organizers did not see this story arc, this bigger story arc of the article. So I think that is an important sort of skill for us to have as communicators. And incidentally, this is also why the humanities are so important, right? And why it's important to teach Shakespeare in the public schools, to not lay off the arts and writing teachers, right? The liberal arts, right, were originally taught by the ruling classes to their sons as it's a technology for leading society, and democratizing that technology. I think that's right. That's part of what we do. What we're doing, we're working with our members in terms of how to tell their stories and how to understand their stories. I think is we're doing liberal arts. And so I also think that's a reason why it's also really important that we do not give up on the labor press. My predecessor as the UE News editor actually ran a feature in UE News about 10 or 11 years ago called The Incredible Shrinking Labor Press. A lot of times, if we go to union websites and it's full of press releases and press coverage, but nothing generated by the union telling their own story. I partly believe this as the editor of the UE News, right? We still have a print paper that goes out to our members to their homes. I think this is important because as unions, we have, not to say that obviously the media stuff, the broader media stuff is really important, but as unions, we have direct access to a very defined segment of the working class. And part of our jobs is to provide them with a working class view on life, right? Like we were talking about with Solidarity magazine, what UAW needs. Like Solidarity, the UE News does not just cover contract negotiations, but also history, culture. We do deep dives into issues like immigration, and our membership we represent some significant chunk of immigrant workers, but the vast majority of our membership. Eugene Debs in a much less famous Eugene Debs quote, but one that was hanging up in the UV News office when I got the job. And sadly, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's basically something to say about you should take even more care in selecting the editor of the union paper than the president of the union, because it's the most important job. I don't know how the officers felt when they walked into the union and they saw that, but I always liked it. And it's particularly important, I think, to do this at this moment when, as people sort of say, the working class is so politically divided. Although I would actually argue that working class is really fractured, and that the narrative of division is one that's sort of put upon us by people. And this is certainly true in many of our shops. I mean, our shops are our membership is all over the place politically. But just to briefly tell the story about one of the things that I was, I never know if anyone actually reads the paper, right? I send it out. And one of our, until recently, one of our largest locals, or until recently, our largest local, one of our historic legacy locals, chartered in 1937, is UE Local 506. They're in Erie, Pennsylvania. They represent, at this point, I think about 1,400 workers at a big locomotive manufacturing plant there. Used to be a GE plant. In 2019, GE sold it to a company called Webbed. And they are a model UE local. I often think of them as sort of the last stand of the old CIO. They have a really sort of strong steward system. And they are the local leaders there report that the shop is almost evenly divided on political questions, right? And they have, since 2016, have been very cautious about saying anything political in union meetings, in their papers. Not that they're not principled, right? They took a very strong stand in favor of sort of Black Lives Matter, right? When that happened, they're willing to put their necks out, but they don't sort of needlessly bring up political. Erie County is one of the counties that really sort of had been quote blue forever and really flipped in 2016. I didn't even look at how they voted in 2024. And so for the summer issue last year, summer issue 2024, I did a whole center spread about the election, right? UE has a strong tradition of independent political activism. We rarely endorse any candidates. We certainly were not to endorse Biden or Kamala Harris. But we did a full spread on what is the actual labor record of the Biden administration. What is the actual labor record of the Trump administration? Right? Because we actually had a direct comparison. And had some speak outs from various rank and file workers about the election, just sort of their thoughts about it from around the country. And a month or two later at the National General Executive Board meeting, the president of that local 506 came up to me and said, I want to tell you, at our last local union meeting, a member came in and brought up this UE News spread in the UE News and said, I think we need to talk about the election. And he said it was the most civil conversation about politics that they had in that local for, a decade, if not more. Because it was really focused on workers' issues and because it didn't condescend to people. I bring that up because, I think one of the things that we're up against, or really the fundamental thing that we're up against, is sort of this process whereby the long sort of identification of workers' interests with the Democratic Party is almost completely about. Right? Political scientists call this like class de-alignment. Sort of the fancy political science term, I believe, where your class position is no longer sort of predicts how you will vote the way that it used to. But I think of it more, I was trained more as a historian. So in history, we talk about class formation. That's what historians call it, right? Class formation is the process by which workers come to see themselves as having a common interest with other workers and common enemies. And I think that what we're experiencing is as class deformation, where working people simply don't see the experience of having to go to work and sell their labor power as an important bond with other workers. And in fact, right, you see the term unification of working class more by Republicans at this point than by Democrats. They don't mean the commonality of workers, right? They mean this whole other bucket of weird shit. But it's working, right? And so I think, our duty as labor communicators, as labor activists, or just as rank and file union members, is to use both of our interventions in the broader media world and our own media to be constantly promoting, old-fashioned class consciousness. Class consciousness doesn't just happen, right? It happens through struggle, but it also has to be articulated, right? And that's our job as communicators, is to articulate how these individual stories of worker struggles are part of not even just a struggle with their coworkers, but as part of a common class struggle. We obviously need to be smart about how we promote our cause in media, but we shouldn't give up on our own media. But I think across that, we really need to have a bold vision of how our stories can help us recognize the common class interests. One of the things that we've done is in 2020, we put together this pamphlet called Them and Us Unionism, sort of explaining the basic philosophy of UE. You can find it on our website. And again, in shops that are probably majority Trump supporting, people eat this stuff up because it explains you go to work every day, the boss takes money out of your pocket, and that's why you have something in common with everyone else who goes to work every day, right? And it also goes through into how this sort of played out in culture and politics and things, right? And so, and the key sort of piece of this is recognizing that there are different classes and that different classes have different class interests. And so, I think the thing we really need to be promoting is, in the words of the preamble to the UE Constitution, that the struggle to better our working and living conditions is in vain unless we are united to protect ourselves collectively against the organized forces of the abusers.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Incredible to be reminded of how the frame of our story basically is so determinant of people's consciousness and how we're going to see the world, and how much it's just some really, really basic things that workers have always known and passed down are still incredibly relevant. And it's a really good reminder to be strong in what we actually know about work and about our experiences together. We have some time for questions and answers, and obviously so much to ask these communicators about. So who would like to start us off?
You mentioned the point when you said really a focus on being easy to work with. How can journalists be easier to work with? And sort of what can we do better from your perspective as you No reason.
It's a great question. I have to say, I was really struck when you spoke about your empathy and your recognition that the stories that you write have really big consequences for people's lives. And I think that's really important. And I'm not saying that other journalists don't think that and don't feel that, but I think there's a way when a person's story can be reduced to an anecdote, and the tone of that story can have a really make a big difference in their life. And so I do think that's really important. What else would I say? I think I've certainly dealt with a number of journalists who are really aggressive about wanting to talk to a leader and not talk to a worker. There's sometimes an opposite problem. Yes, there's sometimes an opposite problem where, yes, and but maybe not in the labor journalism world, but in the broader set of reporters that we have to interact with in the business community. Where there's a sense that, certain voices are not official and not representative. So, I guess that's what I would say.
Do you have any thoughts on it, Jimmy? Do
Sorry.
you have any thoughts on
I don't really.
it? Yeah.
It's, I mean, honestly, I don't really love the dealing with reporters part of my job as much as the, I mean, nothing against reporters. It's just, you know, yeah, I honestly, I haven't really had any terrible experiences with journalists, lately. You know, I do, yeah, I think, you know, some of the, well, I'll answer a question from earlier, actually, or reference to my from earlier. There's sort of the question about criticizing unions, right, from over here on the side. I think there is I guess if I had advice for labor journalists, it would be sort of, because I think there's a sort of a gotcha approach to criticizing unions that some on the left are very fond of. And that is, I think, not a helpful way to do criticism, right? And I think also being sensitive to the different roles that rank and file and elected people play, right? It's sort of, you know, off of your question, right? Because sometimes we have someone who has a really good story and they also might not be the best person to opine about the election, right? Or something. So, you know, I mean, if that makes sense, like sort of figuring out the structural things in a union, that would be for advanced labor stuff or something.
Maybe the only other thing that I would add as I'm thinking about it is, and I don't think this is really true for labor journalists, but I do think that sometimes, you know, we represent a similar group of people to the domestic workers. And I think sometimes unions are thought of as like central casting. Like, I need a story about a person who's going to fit this particular mold, usually a victim story. And I want to see the impact of something terrible that's happening in the world in somebody's life. And so I'm going to turn to you to problem with that person to be. And you know what? We might. But the amount of work and energy that it takes for us to find that person, prepare that person, make that person feel confident about what that experience is going to be, and then have that also not be a story that has anything to do with building labor power and who we are as a union, is really taxing. And there's some press requests we just don't return because we are looking to build stories in the kind of public world that are about building power, that feel powerful to the workers who read them. And so that sometimes means we have to be strategic about who we're going to work.
30 or 40 years ago, when I was at the UAW, the Detroit newspapers had very good, sympathetic labor reporters. Helen Bowers, or Helen Fogel, Helen Fogel was the labor reporter of the Detroit Free Trust. She was also the president of the newspaper guild in Detroit, the AFL-CIO union that represents. And she's very sympathetic and would take our suggestions for stories and interviews with. We don't have that anymore. Right now, you've got something like Daniel House, who is kind of a business reporter covering UAW and labor, and it's really difficult to get into the interest in these stories.
Thank you. Next question.
I'll ask them not less of questions, but yeah, first of all, I have two chapters in my book about human here, and I have a chapter about domestic workers, and think one of the reasons for that is definitely that those unions are easy to work with and care about telling their stories. And in my experience as a reporter, like all the unions represented here, I would say are unions that care about telling their stories. And, you know, that's one thing they try to do. And there are other unions on the opposite end that not give a shit about it or actively hostile. And I just wonder, you know, this for interview, but why do you think there's so much variation in unions on that front? And how do you have any thoughts on getting more unions to embrace this and care about?
I mean, well, I'll jump in. So, I mean, we have a very, you know, UE has a very strong tradition of local autonomy, and like I said, we now have members across all sorts of different parts of the economy. So we have an exceptionally diverse membership, and so we have some of that kind of similar diversity in terms of our locals. And Local 506, this local in Erie, actually has, and they've been on strike twice in the last 10 years, in 2019 and again in 2023. And they have a very strong tradition of only the local president speaks to the media, which I have tried to, you know, I've tried to work with them to divest themselves of that. And some of that is, you know, just their own traditions and some of which probably goes back to paranoia, you know, if I'm going to be honest. But also when we did sort of get them to understand that, you know, they needed to have rank and file members who could tell stories about why mandatory overtime would be devastating to families. I did get to, particularly during the 2019 strike, did get to work with some rank and file members on that, and they were, and again, this is sort of a stereotypical, you know, old manufacturing unions, a lot of white guys, and they were remarkably had very little confidence in telling their own stories. You know, it was really striking, and I think some of that is there is like no media, right, that where they see people like themselves doing good things, right, and which is weird, right, because there's of course like white men all over the place, right, but not white men like them acting in solidarity, right, or being vulnerable, right, because that's really what we were asked to do. So, I think some of that dynamic might play out at least at the sort of local level in much of the rest of the
Yeah, I think so.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I have had to spend many years organizing internally within the union to help crack through a perception of the media as the media and not as people, and as people who are not. And there's, I think, a kind of a deep mistrust that was sown for many years, and it's taken some time to kind of cut through that and show people the potential of earned media and of doing work more broadly to be a tool, one of many tools that we have, every tool that we have to use at our disposal to fight capital under very, very difficult circumstances. I think particularly when we're taking on multinational corporations that have brand identities, like it's really important that we figure out how we are thinking about using media. But that's been an organizing project within the union. It was an organizing project to really center workers at the front of the media work, and something we really invested a lot of years in really shifting the culture within our union about how we thought about that. And I think because we're trying to win, we're trying to organize, and we're trying to fight, we've had to confront some of those questions. And I think in different unions, they're all over the spectrum, but I just want to say that was an organizing project for us internally. But I think we have now been the beneficiary of a lot of, I mean, we get hard stories, everybody does, but I think we've mostly been the beneficiaries of stories that have been quite sympathetic to the people who we represent and what they're trying to do, the lives that they're trying to build for themselves. And that breeds trust and openness and possibility. I think most locals would now see it as a really essential part of any way that we campaign. Sorry.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Frank Hammer. I was an organizer at a GM plant in Warren. Still organizing today with the rank and file democracy movement within the UAW. What I want to bring up is to bring up a different slice of what it means to talk about telling labor's story. Because if there's one thing we need to understand today, and you were making reference to multinational corporations, is that we are an international labor movement, an international working class. And how that story gets filtered and told and shared with US workers. And I have two pieces of that I want to bring up and kind of get your reactions. On the one hand, I've been involved in a 14-year struggle involving injured, fired GM workers in Bogota, Colombia. And it's a story that the UAW just broke out in the last week on Facebook in regards to demanding of General Motors justice for these workers that were injured on the job and subsequently fired. And there's been a 14-year movement that has sustained that struggle. They have an encampment in front of the US Embassy in Bogota. And how does that story get shared and told with the US working class? Because we are part of that same class, especially all of it. And then the other side of the story, which I'm also involved with, is the role of the AFL-CIO in regards to something called the Solidarity Center, which receives money from the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. And how does that impact our labor movement, especially as that money goes to Solidarity Center ventures around the world in about 60 or 70 countries? It's quite a lucrative enterprise, lots of money from NED, which of course recently has all been compromised by DOGE and the Trump administration. So these are two international different aspects of ways that we can filter this information to, fellows in working class movement, brothers and sisters in this country. And I wonder if you would react to that. And I will want to just point out that my dear comrade, Dave Elsila, was working in Solidarity magazine as the editor. It was a very international publication. And I go back to issues and just marvel at how much international information Solidarity magazine had under Dave's watch. Then I'll stop it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could talk about international solidarity until the cows come home. Actually, that's one of the reasons why we left the CIO, broke with the CIO. We left and then they expelled us. In 1949, it was actually over questions of foreign policy. And we upheld labor's right to have an independent view on foreign policy and to not carry out foreign policies of the US government, which is essentially what the Solidarity Center or A-Field before it did for a long time. But more recently, right, when in the lead up to NAFTA, right, when most unions were in the US were opposing NAFTA on the basis of sort of Mexican workers will steal jobs, we went and found a Mexican union, right, which is difficult because of the complications of Mexican labor history, to find an independent union in Mexico, but and began developing what has now been more than 30-year history of very close relations with an independent union in Mexico called Frente Atlético del Trabajo, or FAD. And the thing that we have found that is the most effective in getting in having our members understand the importance of international solidarity is face-to-face contact. We do regular worker-to-worker exchanges where we send delegations to Mexico, we bring delegations to Mexico first. That's, both in terms of matching up workers within the same supply chain, right, in the same companies and within the same industries. But it has also been just like incredibly educational for our members to understand immigration, right? Where when they meet Mexican workers who explain how difficult it is to make a living in Mexico, and they're like, we don't want, we don't want our kids coming there, but there's no jobs, right? And that kind of thing. And then both sort of obviously that has a real deep impact on the individual rank and file members who participate in those or who meet participants in Mexican delegation. But we also then tell that story, right, through our union publications to the degree that we can get it into other media. Because it's those worker-to-worker connections of people literally sort of talking about, oh, as a municipal worker in Chihuahua, you are facing the same workers that I'm facing as a municipal worker in Danbury, Connecticut. That is really compelling, both for those individuals and then also it's a compelling story to tell.
I remember an interesting story that we did maybe 35 years ago. I went to a Chrysler Plymouth dealer on Mack Avenue in Detroit and looking for a Plymouth Acclaim car. And there were two cars on the showroom floor, identical in every way, except one was made in Newark, Delaware, and one was made in Toluca, Mexico. The Newark, Delaware car was made by workers who were making $15 or $16 an hour at the time. The workers in Toluca, Mexico were making maybe $3 or $4 a day. And I asked the salesperson, well, can I get this car from Mexico for less money? And he didn't know what I was talking about, but we did a 2-page spread in Solidarity magazine with the photographs of the two cars, identical cars, and pointed out to our readers, to UAW members, that those savings are not being passed down to consumers. They're being passed down to you. Who's getting it? For the bosses in General Motors Corporation, probably surplus value. The importance of solidarity, of international solidarity.
Yeah. Thank you. So the day after the election, I'm in a class here, and the student, we had a math class beforehand, so one of my labor history students, and one student, when we were like, you're like an economy guy, right? I'm like, kind of. And they're like, how do tariffs work? Like, my friend says it's going to make stuff cheaper. I'm like, no, that's not how it's going to work, right? They're like, I knew it. That's how we did it. Interesting to notice these basic things and just what you said about that exchanges, everyone's what you're saying about like the form of a story, right? Like a person that you actually meet cannot be reduced to 15 seconds of their life that you can say, well, this person's doing this now. They're just so much harder to deal with, but it's such a richer experience that is actually transformative in terms of health. You know, that's really, really powerful. Do we have more questions? Yes.
Well, this is more of a comment, but I want to ask the help of people here. If you know anybody in Flint or have contacts there, Frank and I are trying to develop a educational website around Flint and its history as a microcosm of the American auto industry. The Flint story is probably some of the most powerful stuff of this century. The Flint sit-down strike literally stands out as probably one of the most important labor relations events. And there is a wonderful movie called With Babies and Banners about women in the Flint sit-down strike. If you have not seen it, look it up. It is an absolutely wonderful movie made by Lynn Goldfarb, and it was nominated for an Academy Award. And it front lines the story of Flint. So if you know anybody or think you're interested in that project or want to help us, we'd be happy to hear from you. And you mentioned the role of women in World War II. There is another wonderful film that not very many people have seen called The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter. And it is an absolutely amazing movie made by Connie Fields, who is one of the most talented filmmakers in the country. She even made a film about an opera about my life.
Wow.
Just an amazing woman. So look up Connie Fields and Lynn Goldfarb and you will not be disappointed.
Hey, well, I'm Brian Yap, and I get the pleasure of being the Deputy Director of Motor Cities National Heritage Area, which promotes automotive labor history across Michigan. So Michigan's automotive labor history, and we are funded eventually by the National Park Service. Standing by if anybody gets an email. But lunch was very important to you. I'm go hungry. But we talk about the documentation of history, telling the story, and that's really what our mission is to make sure we tell the story of all that has happened and continues to happen, and get the chance to tell that story of a living industry. Some of our colleagues around the country talk about battlefields and fjords and mountains, but we get to talk about an industry that continues to evolve and change. With that comes the challenge of documenting that story. So both of our journalists are active and retired storytellers, and even archivists like Gavin. It seems like there's a challenge in how this information is going to be maintained, like the form that it's taken now, the fact that you don't have newspapers and documentation articles. So what does that look like for the future of the way this stuff is going to be documented and maintained? 30 years from now, you'll be going back talking about these very significant events because we service a living industry, but they'll be in a very different format than film microfiche and scan front pages. It'll be like, are you documenting social media posts? I mean, how does it work for the long term? Easy question, I guess.
Honestly, I think that's a real issue, and I am jealous of the AFT and the UAW and other unions that have their own archivists. We like here do not, and there are digital records of things that happened 15 years ago that are monumentally important to the history of the union movement, and I have no idea where they are. There are things that live on digital servers that have gotten, and I think it's a real issue. And as somebody who's just been so focused on trying to stay 30 seconds ahead of what is happening, it's not something that I have until recently, until trying to document our own union's history, have realized that it is such a problem. I kind of leave it to the archivists or the other people here to say what the answer is to it. But I think your name needs to be really important and concerning.
Don't delete your organizing chats. We had that panel last year, right? With people who were involved in, who are actively librarians and trained in this, but also organizing in California. And they had some really interesting things to share about, like the importance of archiving that as you go. Like that is where the organizing space is and actually can be captured in a way that, some conversations in the past weren't. But there's of course all the kinds of issues of where does that go and who controls those platforms. But I mean, that is where those stories are. Digital Gavin, would you?
Yeah, basically what it takes is for unions to actively assign somebody to think about that, not just at the international level, but at the local level, and to not just think, well, someone's going to have the password for the drive folder. Because also that person leaves or God forbid somebody passes away or something, you lose access to it. So it takes proactive management to be able to get that stuff. And for Dan and Stephanie also, who's our asked me after this, we're still working on some of the answers. Like I think a long time ago we were talking about email, and we're still not any closer to figuring out a good way to preserve that. But it's I think, but not waiting for something to come to us eventually, but talking to the unions is something that I think we have to connect. Huge what we do.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, I want to put in a promotion for, not only, with all of our massive resources that we're gonna put towards building a better labor journalism, but also, investing in oral history. Specifically, like I first came into the labor movement in Iowa, and the Iowa AFL-CIO in the late 70s voted a per capita and an increase for themselves to create what's called the Iowa Labor History Oral Project that paid someone to go out and do oral history for decades. And this basically lasts, I mean, I think it's been shuttered now because it was housed at the University of Iowa. So I don't know if it still exists. It certainly is no longer part of the University of Iowa. But it is an amazing treasure trove. I mean, they did it because they thought we need to tell the kids the history, and if the kids understand the history, they'll be better. You remember that didn't really work out so well, but it is a great resource for historians, and you're just like incredibly inspiring stories of like rank and file Teamsters from Iowa defying segregated lunch counters in Illinois when they drove through Illinois in the early 50s. Literally threatening to drive their trucks through the diner if their comrade can't sit next to them at the lunch counter, right? That's the most inspiring story. But it is incredible. And we also we just had someone who got a grant to do a bunch of oral history with a bunch of our members in Western Pennsylvania, and that is all history that, if that had not happened, it's in people's heads who are not much longer for this earth in the decades since. So
We had those sorts of incidents. In fact, we have a grant from the National Park Foundation, not service, to do exactly that. War histories. But what we found, and you guys touched on it earlier too, about the ability to get people while they're active, and in most of the conversations we have with those who are retired, because they feel safer, I guess, the fact that they can expose the stories that you just described. Tell us about your experience being the first woman to work at the Lansing GM plant. Well, the person that's working there now is not gonna say, "Oh, it was terrible," they give this, that, and the other, because they still work for the company. The person that retired 20 years ago feels like, now I can feel the tea and story. And so the ability to archive those, and that's what they wanted. They wanted those stories. Don't go talk to the president, go talk to the people who are on the front line. So that's what we can really focus on. So it's good insight there too.
Thank you. We have 1 minute left, I think. So, Dave and then Liz.
I was just going to say, I would love to go back and hear some of those radio shows I was talking about that the UAW did in the 1950s and 1960s, but I don't think anybody thought about it. And I went to work at the UAW for the first time. I went into one of the back storage rooms, and there was an old wire recorder. They used wire recordings for some of their shows, and I don't think that technology is around anymore.
It is here.
Yeah.
Oh, it is here.
I would actually like to thank John for bringing this up, because our training center for workplace issues is just starting up its own pilot oral history project with our aim to help build an archive of oral histories of contemporary labor. Since, as I observed, we haven't really had those oral history projects since the 1970s. So we're trying to start that here. We've already done a pilot, and we're going to grow the program.
Please join me in thanking our incredible panel.